Hello, good afternoon. I'm Eylon Levy, a spokesperson for the Prime Minister's office. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll start with a brief update before taking a few of your questions. Hamas has fired over 8,100 rockets at Israel since the start of the October 7th massacre. We remind you these rockets kill. Over the weekend, there were a number of direct hits on buildings in central Israel, including Tel Aviv. There have also been several sirens in Israeli communities near the Gaza border in just the last hour. Yesterday, a 9-year-old girl, Tamar Chaya Tolpashvili, died a week after suffering a cardiac arrest when an incoming rocket siren was activated in Ashdod. Over 1,400 Israelis have been killed since the start of the October 7th massacre and 5,400 injured. Today, the IDF updated that as it stands, there are at least 230 Israeli hostages inside the Gaza Strip. In terms of a military update, as the Prime Minister briefed last night, we are in the second stage of the war that Hamas declared against us and have expanded our ground operations. These expanded operations support our two key goals. One, destroying Hamas's military and governing capabilities, and two, bringing the hostages back home. This morning, the IDF updated that it had struck more than 450 military targets, including key Hamas commanders over the past 24 hours. We reiterate, this is a war that Hamas dragged the people of Israel into with the October 7th massacre, and this war can end immediately. All Hamas needs to do is lay down its arms, turn over its terrorists for a war crimes tribunal, and release all the hostages immediately, and this war that Hamas began can end immediately. Anyone in the international community concerned with ending this war promptly should make these three basic demands for the sake of international peace and security. Now, turning to our 230 hostages who have been in Hamas captivity for over 3 weeks. As in previous briefings, I want to highlight two of our hostages being held in Gaza. Raz and Aviv Asher, aged 5 and 2.5. They are two of the 33 children being held hostage by Hamas. Raz and Aviv were abducted from Kibbutz Nir Oz on October 7th, together with their mother, Doron Asher Katz, and their grandmother, Efrat. On that Black Saturday, the girl's mother, Doron, called her husband, Yoni, and whispered, "There are terrorists in our house." It is simply inconceivable that Yoni Asher, the girl's father, has his wife, mother-in-law, and two darling little children being held captive, hostage in some dark tunnel in the Gaza Strip. We are fighting this war to bring back our stolen children and to make sure that Hamas can never steal our children again. I also want to address the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which has been getting a lot of media attention. As supplies of virtually every basic human necessity dwindle in Gaza, one group in the besieged enclave remains well stocked: Hamas. You can attribute that quote not to the Israeli government, but to the New York Times. Hamas, the regime that governs the Gaza Strip, is well stocked. Hamas, responsible for the people of Gaza, has enough food, fuel, medicine, and supplies for a long, drawn-out war against our people at the expense of its own. Hamas also controls the distribution and allocation of all resources in Gaza, and Hamas decides when to steal fuel from international agencies, just as it stole fuel from UNRWA 2 weeks ago, as the United Nations admitted. The Gaza Strip has fuel. Here is an aerial shot of Hamas's fuel tankers. They contain 500,000 litres of fuel. I've written the coordinates here in a felt tip pen so that you can find them on Google Maps yourself, and will now type the coordinates into the chat for your convenience. 500,000 litres of fuel. Now let's put that into context. This is a Boeing 747. I've run a back-of-the-envelope calculation, and Gaza has enough fuel to fly this Boeing 747 around the globe. This is a Toyota Hilux, one of the many Toyotas that Hamas imported into Gaza despite the so-called Israeli blockade. Hamas used these cars to rape, burn, behead, torture, execute, and mutilate their way through southern Israel on October 7th. Hamas has enough fuel to circumnavigate the globe 178 times in these cars. Gaza has fuel. Gaza has enough fuel for hospitals. But Hamas prefers to use the fuel to ventilate its tunnels under the hospitals and not the hospital ventilators above ground. Hamas and Hamas alone bears responsibility for any harm that comes to civilians in Gaza, despite our best efforts to get them out of harm's way. For 23 days now, hospitals in Gaza have been warning that they will run out of fuel in 24 hours. But they haven't. Why? Because Hamas has given them enough fuel to remain operational. Why does Hamas want to keep the hospitals operational? Because it is using them as human shields in clear violation of international law. Hamas's operational command center is underneath the Shifa hospital in Gaza. This is a war crime. And I refer you to Article 12.4 of the first additional protocol of the Geneva Conventions, generally taken as a reflection of customary international law, and I quote, "Under no circumstances shall medical units be used in an attempt to shield military objectives from attack." This morning, COGAT presented an overview of the humanitarian situation in Gaza to the international media, and if any of you missed that or want elaboration on the finer points of international law in this conflict, I'm happy to answer questions in our Q&A. Finally, together with our international partners and allies, Israel is exploring a range of potential humanitarian options for civilians in Gaza to ensure that those who need medical treatment can do so in a safe and secure manner. Thank you very much, and I'll now take your questions, beginning with a question that was submitted in advance, and I'll take the opportunity, if you have questions, please do send them to us in advance so we can get as full answers as possible. A question from Antenna TV in Greece. The IDF published today a list of at least 55 high-ranking Hamas members, including the organizers of the October 7th attacks, who have been killed in current operations. Approximately how many more do you need to take out in order to decapitate Hamas? The answer is all of them. The Prime Minister has been clear. Every Hamas terrorist is a dead man walking. Every Hamas terrorist represents a clear and immediate danger to the security of our citizens in a war that they declared on us on October 7th. Every Hamas terrorist is a legitimate military target. And if it takes 1 month, 1 year, 5 years, or 25 years, we will bring to justice every monster involved in the October 7th massacre, and anyone who hurts our hostages, they will all pay. Israel is continuing with its precision strikes to eliminate Hamas's leadership. In recent days, we have taken out the deputy head of military intelligence, a former head of Hamas military intelligence, the head of the aerial array, who was responsible for those horrific paragliders we saw swooping into Israel on October 7th in order to massacre people at the Nova Music Festival, the commander of the Gaza Brigade Naval Forces, and many more. Also a question from Antenna TV in Greece about the situation in the West Bank and the presence of Hamas there. We know that Hamas is determined to escalate a war on all fronts. We've seen numerous attempts to do so just this week, urging Hezbollah to escalate its attacks against our people in the north. We're doing everything we can and everything needed to further contain violence and fight terror wherever it raises its head. Just last week, for example, the IDF conducted an aerial strike on an underground terror compound at the Al-Ansar Mosque in Jenin, in Judea and Samaria. The site contained a terror cell of Hamas and Islamic Jihad terror operatives who are organizing an imminent terror attack. If we have any questions, please raise your hand or submit questions in the chat. We have a question from Stephen Callin, please. Stephen, we're taking you off mute. Hello? Yes, loud and clear. Thank you, Stephen. What media outlet are you from? Wall Street Journal. First of all, I cannot elaborate on any operational matters beyond that which the IDF has elaborated on. So the questions about the internet, I would refer to the military, not the Prime Minister's office. Second, the question on humanitarian aid. As we have said consistently throughout this war, Israel wants to see humanitarian aid reach the people of Gaza through the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. That is the correct route for it to enter, especially considering that on the morning of October 7th, Hamas attacked the crossing points with Israel and butchered everyone inside who would otherwise be responsible for handling shipments of humanitarian aid through the Israeli crossings that have since been destroyed. We have only one condition, which is, of course, our right and duty under international law to ensure that any humanitarian aid not reach Hamas. We know, for example, that the last time fuel entered the Gaza Strip, it was requisitioned by Hamas. It stole 24,000 litres of fuel from UNRWA. UNRWA admitted as much in a tweet on October 16th, a tweet that it subsequently deleted under pressure. We know, for example, from available OSINT monitoring where flour has gone into the Gaza Strip. Some 20% of the flour that entered the Gaza Strip has gone to bakeries that no longer exist because they were fronts for Hamas control centers that have subsequently been destroyed in the course of the war. So we know that Hamas is trying to exploit these humanitarian corridors in order to fill up its own stockpiles at the expense of the people of Gaza. We know that they're going to try to continue using these avenues to fill their own reserves instead of making sure that they reach the people of Gaza. And we are adamant that we will not allow Hamas to exploit the international community's goodwill in order to rearm itself and fill up its own supplies to continue a long and protracted war against Israel. But of course, we want to see all the humanitarian aid that is necessary to reach the people of Gaza and meet their humanitarian needs through the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. Another question from Anna, please. Hello, Anna. The Prime Minister was responding to a question that was raised at the press conference yesterday. He thought he was making a helpful clarification. The Prime Minister made a mistake. Those were remarks that should not have been made, and he apologized for them in that tweet. We're putting this incident behind us and moving together, united, both as a government and a nation, to proceed with our aims of destroying Hamas in response to the October 7th massacre. I'm personally not aware of any casualties on our side as a result of the ground operations, but the IDF is the authoritative source of information for any military casualties.
I've put you on mute.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few questions in the chat.
Okay.
The first is from Jim Williams from Zenga News Service.
Yep.
How does Israel play by the rules of war? If Hamas does play by the same rules, what would, I think the second part's more relevant, what was the three rules Israel would stop the war that you mentioned earlier?
Okay.
I know you're off mute now, but just basically trying to repeat the question.
Thank you. We have a question from Jim Williams about the conditions for ending this war and Israel's application of international law. Our three conditions are this, as Ambassador Gilad Erdan, our representative at the United Nations, stated on Friday after that shameful UN vote. Hamas must lay down its arms. It must turn over all of its terrorists to be brought to justice at a war crimes tribunal, and it must return all those hostages. Our campaign in response to Hamas's war against us is to destroy its terrorist and governing capabilities inside the Gaza Strip. And if the pedophile rapists who perpetrated the October 7th massacre hand themselves in for justice, then of course we can end this war immediately and peacefully. As for the question of international law, the Israeli army takes very seriously its commitments under international law and integrates all the relevant procedures into its battle doctrines. We have been clear. On October 7th, the Israeli people were the victims of an unprovoked act of aggression, an act of genocide. Indeed, when Hamas death squads entered our villages in an act of systematic extermination to try to murder as many people as possible, that triggers our right and our duty under international law to defend ourselves. And as part of our proportional response to defending ourselves against this threat of annihilation, we are going to dismantle the terror organization that perpetrated the massacre so it can never do that again. In accordance in selecting its targets, the IDF moves judiciously in order to apply the rules of proportionality and make sure that the targets that it is taking out are proportionate and commensurate with the military advantage to be achieved, which is to prevent the people of Israel from ever again being the victims of a jihadi group that can invade us at will, burn whole families alive in their homes, rape little girls so brutally that it breaks their bones, abduct our grandmothers, behead people, including babies. That is the nature of the military advantage that we are trying to achieve in this war, and the IDF incorporates that and takes that into account and all the relevant procedures in deciding how it is going about targeting Hamas terrorists inside the Gaza Strip. I would add, of course, Israel has been taking extreme efforts to avoid civilian casualties inside the Gaza Strip. It has been over 2 weeks since the IDF gave the residents of the northern Gaza Strip 24 hours to evacuate for their safety. It's been that 24-hour deadline has now lasted over 2 weeks. The reason the IDF gave that warning is because Hamas has embedded the bulk of its terrorist infrastructure in civilian areas, its tunnels underneath people's homes in the northern Gaza Strip. I'll refer you just at the end of last week, the IDF released exposed intelligence showing that Hamas's operational command center is located underneath the Shifa hospital in the Gaza Strip, which is, of course, a violation of international law, as we explained with reference to Article 12.4 of the first additional protocol of the Geneva Conventions. Any further elaboration? Happy to take any questions on that. I'm not aware.
The other question is, does the Prime Minister's office have any comment about whether the command centre underneath the hospital is a legally justifiable target? And if it is, how much further time will be given for evacuation? It's a question as a result of the fact that we ran this Zoom session with Dr. Daphne Richmond-Barra.
Okay, I'll take it.
I'll bring it off mute, but just to mention the reference that I should bring it off mute.
Sure. We have a question about the Al-Shifa hospital. I am, of course, not going to comment or speculate on the targets that the Israeli military is planning to strike in an effort to destroy Hamas's military infrastructure, but it is important to be aware of the relevant provisions of international law, and I refer again to the first additional protocol of the Geneva Conventions, to which Israel is not a signatory, but is generally taken by international jurists as a reflection of customary law in the laws of international armed conflict to the extent that they apply in this conflict. Article 12, protection of military medical units. Article 12.4, under no circumstances shall medical units be used in an attempt to shield military objectives from attack. Article 13.1 states, and I quote in full, "The protection to which civilian medical units are entitled shall not cease unless they are used to commit, outside their humanitarian function, acts harmful to the enemy. Protection may, however, cease only after a warning has been given, setting, whenever appropriate, a reasonable time limit, and after such warning has remained unheeded." The Geneva Conventions, and I'm not an international lawyer, and I would refer you to the many who have already commented on this matter, but the Geneva Conventions are clear that even civilian infrastructure, when used for a military purpose, may become legitimate military targets in accordance with several other rules of international law, such as proportionality and precaution, of course, subject to a reasonable time limit being given. These are the applicable provisions of the first additional protocol of the Geneva Conventions, to the extent that the laws of international armed conflict apply to this conflict with a non-state actor.
Last question from the chat. Does Israel consider there is enough international pressure for Hamas to release hostages? Are there other international measures that could help to determine Hamas, ensure that Hamas releases hostages?
We have a question about whether there is enough international pressure on Hamas to release the hostages. The answer is no, and the evidence is that there are still at least 230 Israeli hostages inside the Gaza Strip. Hamas released 4 hostages as a result of pressure, both Israeli military pressure and international diplomatic pressure. We want to see more of that pressure, as the Prime Minister has been very clear from the very beginning of this campaign. Hamas is ISIS. Hamas is worse than ISIS. No country in the world would have diplomatic relations with ISIS or shield or harbor ISIS on its territory. No country in the world should be shielding ISIS right now, and we are calling for international sanctions against countries that are shielding Hamas. We want to see more international pressure. Of course, we would gladly and willingly get our hostages, our stolen children, back by the most peaceful means possible. So we'll take one question from Jim. Okay. Jim, we have another question from you, please. A question about international support. Israel is building an international coalition at the moment to fight Hamas and defeat it, just as the world defeated ISIS. We had British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak here telling the Prime Minister the UK wants Israel to win. President Biden, of course, saying Israel will have everything it needs to win. And I remember that press conference with President Macron saying that France wants Israel to fight terrorism without mercy, were his words. I'll refer you to the sham at the United Nations on Friday, when the United Nations passed a resolution without mentioning Hamas. Astonishingly, it's like passing a resolution 3 weeks after 9/11 without mentioning al-Qaeda and without calling for a release of the hostages. And I believe 88 nations voted in favor of the Canadian amendment that would have firmly condemned the Hamas terror attacks that began with the October 7th massacre and called for the immediate return of the hostages. And when you look at the democratic nations that voted in favor of that resolution to condemn Hamas and compare it with the countries that voted in favor of the resolution that ultimately passed, including North Korea, Russia, and Iran, I think it's very clear that the international community understands that Israel must dismantle Hamas, to quote the words of President Obama himself, as part of its exercise of its right to self-defense. Okay, that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much. Hopefully we will convene at the same time tomorrow. And everyone, please keep safe. And if there's a rocket siren, please do heed the warnings of the Home Front Command. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.